Did you know that America has always seen pretty significant inflation? I mean, look at this graph. You can see, I drew a couple of lines to help guide the eye, that there's been some deviations, but clearly these two lines are around similar slopes. There's not too much going on here. Now, if you're intelligent, you know what I've done here. I've chosen a map specifically between the years of 1975 and 2019. I've basically selected an area where inflation was relatively constant, but in order to bolster my argument, but I've chosen those endpoints arbitrarily. So if we choose different endpoints, like say if we put somewhere like 1971 at the center, we get a graph that looks like this. And we will discover that the rate of inflation is very different before the early 1970s compared to after the early 1970s. I wonder why that is. So, this is a video that I've been trying to put together for a little while, and it's a surprisingly short video for how much time it took me to put together. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that if you're trying to make an argument, and your argument depends on you choosing certain arbitrary endpoints or certain arbitrary events as the basis for your argument, you can't really complain when other people use that same argument but decide to choose other endpoints. So, it's not necessarily that the argument is faulty. That might even be too strong a word. But what it is it's an argument where depending on which endpoints you choose, you get different results, and therefore the argument, if not faulty, is at least not universalizable, right? It's not some kind of universal truth. Let's move on to our actual topic. I was watching an episode of Dave Smith and Robbie Bernstein's Part of the Problem podcast, and it was one in April, and so that's how long I've been thinking about this approximately. And they showed a clip of a woman named Elica Le Bon. I'll put a link in the description to the Part of the Problem episode if you want to go watch that. It's a good one. Elica Le Bon makes the argument that
because of Hamas's decision, that set off a chain of events that led to a war. And every single death that results from that war is caused by Hamas.
Hamas has all responsibility for the deaths of people in Gaza because they started the fight. Now, this is an example of an argument that depends entirely upon which endpoints you choose to, decide how the argument goes. For instance, we could look at the blockade that's been going on since 2007. Well, guess what? A blockade is commonly understood as an act of war. And since Israel has committed an act of war on the people of Gaza, they have a right to retaliate. And therefore, all of the deaths of all the people in Israel are Israel's fault, not Gaza's. Similarly, we could look at the 2018 protests, where the UN took a look at the Israeli security forces shooting a bunch of random people. And some of those people were, members of violent organizations. They weren't doing anything violent necessarily, but they were members of violent organizations. But the vast, vast majority of them were not. They were just random people selling sandwiches or, helping a dude with a flat tire or something like that. The point is not necessarily that the argument is wrong, but that the argument is not universal. Elica Le Bon cannot complain when other people take the same argument and come to a 180-degree different conclusion, because the argument and where the argument leads is highly dependent on which endpoints you choose. And, of course, there are more endpoints that we could choose that would arrive at Elica Le Bon's conclusion, right? We could look at rocket attacks from Gaza into Israel. We could look at attacks on settlers or something like that. The point is that this argument is a very bad one for this particular purpose because it is so dependent on the arbitrary points that you choose as the things that are important that you choose as important to the argument. We might even say that Elica Le Bon would say, well, these things aren't organized violence against yada, yada, yada. I mean, a blockade is typically understood as an act of war. Having your military mass shoot, random innocent people because they happen to be close to a protest is typically regarded as, an international crime, if not an act of war. But setting that aside, look at what happened in the last couple of days. Is Le Bon going to argue that all of the deaths in Israel are Israel's fault because Israel made the first strike on Iran? Probably not. Even if she does, other people will probably not be as consistent. In fact, what's probably going to happen is that people who are making this argument will say Iran, by funding, tentatively, assume arguendo that Iran has actually provided funding for Hamas. Well, that funding is going to be the reason why Israel was allowed to make a first strike and why Iran and Hamas are responsible for the deaths and not Israel. It's a very self-serving argument, and anybody can use it to serve themselves, especially in the longest, brutalist, most violent family feud that, the world has seen in the last couple of centuries. Even if we make the point that it has to be, some kind of hostile act, some kind of overtly violent act, well, then Iran's not guilty of that. So we have to change the criteria. Making arguments like this is generally a bad idea because how these arguments are used is not dependent on you. The fact that you've used this argument means that other people on the other side can use that argument and choose their endpoints arbitrarily as well, giving them the same argument against you that you have against them. This is kind of why I was talking about blowback farming a couple of videos ago, right? The idea that some guy is like, well, we can kill all of them that we want, it's not a big deal for us. And that danger is not going to come back on him. That danger is going to come back on people that he supposedly represents. The same thing is true of, pro-Israel or pro-Hamas activists making the same argument, the same non-universal argument in their own particular favor. The other side is just going to make the same argument, but choose different endpoints. The lesson here is that when someone makes an argument that chooses a particular endpoint or a particular event as the big deal, as the catastrophe that catalyzed everything into motion, it's always good to look at that endpoint as itself to see if there are other things around it that are similar in nature, and to look at whether that argument is dependent on that endpoint specifically and could be turned around if we just choose a different endpoint. In the same way that we can look at inflation in the United States from two different perspectives, we can look at this particular issue from multiple different perspectives. People who are going to make public arguments need to make sure that they actually have decent arguments, or else they end up looking like an idiot, as Elica Le Bon does. That's really all I wanted to say today. Nice short one. Took me too long to set this up, but by some horrible coincidence, I now have another point to make about Elica Le Bon's point, because she sure as hell is not, well, I guess I don't know for sure, but my suspicion is that she and others like her are not saying that, well, the deaths in Israel are Israel's fault because they attacked Iran. But unfortunately for them, that is an argument that people are at liberty to make. So, that's what I've got for today. I am about ready to do my part 3 of Rousseau's social contract. I've got the notes here. Just need to actually do the recording and put together the intro movie and all that good stuff. That will be coming next, later this week. And until then, have a good week, and I will see you next time. As always, if you like what I'm doing with this channel and you want to support me, support the channel, you know what to do. There will be links in the description and stuff, and I will see you next time. Have a good week.